How many people in here are married or engaged? Marriage has changed drastically and dramatically since the 1960s, and in this presentation, I will explain to you how it has changed. So in the 1960s and the early 1950s onto the 1960s, there was a traditional marriage where men and women got married and they stayed true to their vows, and women pretty much didn't have the right to divorce or have any rights to the male's property. When the women married into the family of the man, their property became their husband's property, and their husband's property stayed their husband's property. They had no right to that. They also had to pretty much obey and abide by all the rules and the laws set by the male. They couldn't go and work. They had to stay home and do chores and take care of the kids because that was the woman's job in the 1960s. And according to Shavana, she states the woman spent an average of 55 hours just on domestic chores, which was, doing the dishes, sweeping, laundry, etc. Their roles sort of related to the secretary's job, whereas they had to pretty much, relay any message to the husband, basically had to take care of the husband without question, do what he says. The women also had no jobs because, as stated before, they could not work and had no right to work because the male was the breadwinner in the family. Later on in the 1960s, there was an end to traditional marriage because the women wanted more free will to do what they wanted to do and were tired of being ruled by the husband. So they began the American feminist movement, whereas they wanted the right to vote, the right to work, equality in the workplace, and equality in other places as well as the household. There was also an uprising of same-sex couples and the LGBT community in wanting recognition. Birth control also arrived on the market, which gave the woman the free decision to have sex if she wanted to or not have sex. It pretty much gave her control over her body, and nobody had a say-so in that. From these moments of bliss to the rights of women, marriage customs and factors were starting to see a change in the will of women. So now we'll move on to the 1970s marriage. In 1970s, marriages started to become more diverse. Interracial couples were being seen, and this is also where the birth control pill was introduced. Frank states, Americans blame and credit birth control as the start of the sexual revolution of women, whereas women pretty much would start to either have sex with more men or deny the men sex because they didn't want to. But women in the 1970s were more hesitant to take birth control because they didn't want to seem like a bad girl. They wanted to have that good girl mentality and the appearance of a good girl, so they're more hesitant to take birth control. People also started to date outside the race. As stated before, there were more interracial couples, interracial marriages. So from this interesting point, we now enter into the marriage where women have more freedom and independence, which is in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, interracial marriage increased and women gained more control. They had more of their own free will. There was no more traditional dates where people used to go out and meet people in person and then set up a date that way. Online dating became more evident. They went online to meet people instead of going out. Rosenfeld also states that there was an increase in interracial marriages, as stated before. Black men and black and white women and white women and black men and etc. etc. The ethnic races pretty much started dating each other and got married and didn't really care what other people had to say about them because they wanted to be married to each other and they had every right to be. Cohabitation was also more evident in the 1980s, whereas back in the 1960s and 1950s, women had to marry the man in order to live with him, but in the 1980s, women pretty much didn't care. They would, cohabitate with the man. So So as you can see, women are starting to put their foot down about having their own free will to do and say as they please, which I will now move on to marriages in the 1990s to present day. So complete independence from women. Women can now go out and get jobs on their own. They don't have to rely on the man to take care of them. Their role as breadwinner has become their own because they don't need to depend on anyone to take care of them. They can have any job they want to. They can go out and find any job that they need to in order to take care of themselves. Marriage was no longer a necessity for women because they had their independence. They didn't need somebody to take care of them. The caretaker still remained the women's job, but more so you start to see males take on that responsibility, whereas women back in the 1960s had to take care of the kids, and the husband pretty much just came home and did whatever he wanted to without even, tending to the kids or asking about the kids, because that was the women's job back in the 1960s. Rosenberry states, although legal marriage no longer makes distinctions between the wives more often than their husband performing or overseeing child care and housework, as well as engaging in more of the emotional work or of family life. So finally we got into the marriages that are today. So in summary, I've just introduced how marriage has changed since the 60s. First there was the stay-at-home mom, then the women began to have more rights. After that there was the decline in marriage. Now women have the right to do whatever it is that they want. So overall, there has been many changes in the marriages since the 1960s, and there will continue to be more changes in marriages because people are different and there are more diversity in marriages. So who plans on getting married anytime soon?